Tyson Langland came back from a career in data and analytics, working with NFL football teams, to his family's farm. And he took over the livestock operation and used his data and analytics background to really move the needle on their cattle's maternal traits. He had some great mentors in doing this.
How can we be profitable while moving our genetic base forward? And they laid the groundwork with a lot of that.
But once they got the maternal traits that they were looking for, they still found themselves needing to make some more tweaks.
Once we kind of got our genetic base figured out, the things that I was visually appraising were we had very well functioning cattle that were maternal. Our breed up rates were always very good. The only thing that left me wondering for more was, how can we inject a little bit of performance into this? I don't want it to turn into a complete terminal deal, but I feel like we're missing out.
Today on Working Cows Podcast, episode 433, we're going to talk to Tyson about how they used genomic testing to accomplish their goals related to balancing maternal traits with performance. All that and more today on the Working Cows Podcast, brought to you by Understanding Ag.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Howdy, everybody. It's Clay Connery, host of the Working Cows Podcast, recorded exclusively in the Understanding Ag studios. And I'm very excited to be joined by Tyson Langland. Tyson has been a guy that I would count as a friend throughout this Working Cows Podcast journey. I met him through the podcast, and he is always struck me as a really fascinating, interesting, and smart guy. And you're going to hear why that is. I mean, he had a data and analytics background in a company that worked with NFL football teams, and then he brings it back to the farm and uses those skills to move the needle on their cowherd. And we're going to talk to him about that today. Excited to share this conversation with you right after a word from our sponsor today, Understanding Ag. As farmers and ranchers, we've all heard pitches from ag consultants about the next great new product that will increase our yields, pounds, or animal performance. And each of those silver bullets comes with a price tag that you pay year after year, taking more money out of your pockets and putting it into someone else's. Our friends at Understanding Ag aren't out to sell you anything, but the knowledge to grow healthier soils, plants, animals, and profits. Their goal is to help you become your own best manager, a short-term client, but a long-term friend and partner on the road to regeneration. If you're still waiting for that next year that's going to be better, maybe it's time you give Understanding Ag a call. Check them out at understandingag.com. I know you'll be glad you did. Tyson, thanks for joining me today on the Working Cows Podcast.
I appreciate you having me, Clay, and it definitely is an honor.
Well, I've always appreciated your perspective. I think that a lot of times there's the old cliche of all hat and no cattle, and I think you're the opposite. You're no hat but all cattle, and
And that is definitely the truth. You know, growing up in a family where we're called East River cowboys, which are more farmers than anything. But it's been an opportunity through my family. We've always raised cattle. I'm third generation, and we definitely look more like farmers than cowboys, but we definitely will say that we know how to raise a good cow and a calf. So,
yeah. And talk to me about that journey for you as far as kind of some of your influences in the way that you think about what makes a good cow and kind of how you've grown in that over the years.
I'll take you way back. I started out of high school. I was always involved in the farm and the ranching aspect. And it was one of those things where financially it wasn't viable for me to be a part of it right out of school. So it was a good conversation with my parents just to do something different and find a way to kind of explore myself till maybe someday that was feasible for me to come back. So I spent a lot of my my time, early 20s, mid 20s in Las Vegas. I went to UNLV. I studied sports management, something totally different than obviously cattle and ranching. And I was always involved in data and analytics with the NCAA while I was going to school there. I did a lot of the same thing after school with a company called Pro Football Focus. We did data and analytics, worked with the New York Giants, other NFL teams. And fast forward, I wanted to use a lot of those same skills that I acquired through whether it be visual data, whether it be computer software, whatever that is. I wanted to use that on the farm and ranch when I was able to come back about 10 years ago now. And I've always had a love for beef cattle. And, we always have one of those things in my mind that I've always had is what is the perfect beef cow? To some people, it may be larger framed, smaller framed, medium framed, whatever your quote unquote unicorn cow is. I was heavily influenced by the likes of John Cotton, who's locally in Volga. He's raised Angus cattle with his family. They are a very, I would say, old school operation, and they haven't bought into the trends of EPDs and things of that nature where they've always bred based on phenotype and lineage. And Ricky Highland's another one. He's by Madison, South Dakota. Him and John worked together for years. So when I came back to our farm, I really, really invested in those guys, and they invested in me too, and just kind of taught me. And I always wanted a moderate framed, easy fleshing cow that, was really, really feed efficient and doesn't have to raise the biggest calf, but always brings that calf to weaning. And for me, it was how can we be profitable while still moving our genetic base forward? And they laid the groundwork with a lot of that.
What have been some of the keys to that, moving the genetic base forward? What have been some of the things that you've paid attention to and the levers that you've been using to push on?
So when I turned our family's Cowherd over, it would have been about 8 years ago now. We had very large frame, 1,900-pound cows that were not efficient. The breeding system was very strung out. So the first thing I was looking at is fertility. How can we use fertility to move the genetic base forward? And some of the most fertile cows I came in contact with were the ones of the two gentlemen that I mentioned. So we started with fertility, and we moved our own family's breeding window. We used to be March, April calvers, and then we moved it to May, June, simply for the fact that in eastern South Dakota, much like other places in the Midwest, you can still see quite a few heavy snowfall events, even in April. So we just thought, well, let's match that forage base, which forage starts coming on early in May, and then it starts to really peak, I would say, towards the end of May, beginning of June. So that's one thing that helped that was fertility, get the breeding window to 45 days. And then after that, there wasn't a lot of other levers that we pulled early on other than let's just tighten up that window and let's see what these cows can do. The fallout was very heavy the first and second year, but once we had a good idea and started buying bulls from a John Cotton or a Ricky Highland or, some of that Shoshone and oldie influence, that's really what turned the corner.
So the fallout, how did you manage through that? What were some of the things that you guys did to, what did that herd look like after a couple of years? Were you having to buy replacements and just be choosy about where you got them? Or what did the herd kind of look like? What was that process like?
Yeah, it was very tough the first couple of years. A different business venture came out of it, which was a direct market beef business. And we have a pretty thriving direct market beef business now where we sell 30 to 40 animals direct to consumer every year, 60 plus families in the South Dakota, Iowa, and Minnesota area. But it didn't start that big, but we started small and we did only ground beef to start with. So we took those animals that didn't breed in that 45-day window and we put them on either lush grass, cover crops, or a quality alfalfa orchard grass feed and indirectly started our beef business. We weren't able to market them all that way the first few years, but going down the line, I would say we have very few cull animals anymore that go to the sale barn. We mostly market if they're in good flesh and they're able to flesh up easily. We'll market them ourselves. But yeah, so it was hard the first 2 years outside of the direct market beef. Cattle prices were very low, as you know, 8 to 9 years ago. Coal prices were not good. I had some money that I had saved up when I came back to the farm that I was able to use of outside farm income to use toward rebuilding the herd. We had bought some cattle for that was similar in program out of North Dakota. We bought some out of Chamberlain, South Dakota, that we thought that really fit that ideal cow that we were after. And I would say they were a partial success. The ones we bought out of North Dakota, we still have probably about half of those. So they've proven their longevity. The first half of those fell out quite quick. And the ones out of Chamberlain are probably our best. We bought a pot load of those, and I still think out of those 40, we still have 26 left. So, yeah, it's just, adapting the environment, and things like that. But financially, it was hard, and it was kind of my task to rebuild it. So I had to put a little bit of my own outside money into it. Right now, we have no debt against our female cattle. We keep all of our own replacement heifers, but getting through that definitely was a challenge.
Yep. And it was just kind of the lessons that you learned from some of those influences you mentioned that helped you figure out where to go and buy replacements. Is that how you approach that?
Yeah. So just in having conversations, it was one of the things that I was never really that interested in EPDs, because EPDs, when I first started using them, we've been a base commercial operation. EPDs weren't appealing for the simple fact that we don't have registered seed stock, even though the people that we were talking to were registered breeders. But they were able to, we liked what they were doing in the sense of using old genetics that had been proven time and time again, which I know other of your guests have talking about some of those cow lines, whether they go back to the Y or the oldie or Bob Howard and the Shoshone with Larry. And yeah, so that was what really got me interested. It was probably, I don't know how old that episode was, but it was on here, and it was talking, Bob Howard was talking. And I had known O'Leary before, but I think it was after Bob Howard that I went and bought some Shoshone cattle from some of the breeders that are still out there. And I would say Shoshone, more than the Y or the oldie, really helped us move the biggest lever as far as fertility. Because when we bought a lot of those replacements, those were the ones that stuck. And I liked the fact of some of the older proven genetics that you can talk to gentlemen who have bred those cattle for years, and they're very replicatable. They don't always, and we'll get into that, but they're not the full package as far as, performance and things like that. But on the maternal side, I felt like that was a good base and a good place to start.
Yeah, you're in the Wayback Machine with the Bob Howard episode. That was episode 27 of the podcast, and that was within the first 6 months of the launch of the podcast. So I don't hold me responsible for what you hear in that episode. If you want to go back and listen to it, but yes, and I'm still a novice when it comes to these things, but that episode, I specifically remember feeling like I was just barely keeping my nose above water in kind of wrapping my head around what Bob had to say, and yeah, so it probably time to revisit that topic and talk a little bit more.
Sure,
to him as well, but it is a fascinating subject. And yeah, you kind of mentioned that. What have been some of the keys then going forward as you've continued to tweak? What were some of the things that you've noticed, like, oh, this is an issue that we need to try to address? And then how did you go about addressing it?
Yeah, so the biggest thing that came across once we kind of got our genetic base after the rebuild figured out, I knew the things that I was visually appraising were we had very well functioning cattle that were maternal. Our breed up rates were always very good. The only thing that left me wondering for more was, how can we inject a little bit of performance into this? I don't want it to turn into a complete terminal deal, but I feel like we're missing out. Our cow weights were a little bit lower than I had suspected. We do have a scale here on the farm, and we have weighed things from time to time. And, our cows range anywhere from 1050 to 1200 now. But in the beginning, we had a lot of 1,000-pound cows and maybe even some that were under. So we were almost too small on the cow aspect, because then that hurts your end product. We retain all of our own heifers. We direct market a lot of our beef, but we still have a decent number of animals that have to meet the criteria when you're selling at the auction market, whether that be in South Dakota, Nebraska, wherever. They have to be able to fit in, and you have to be able to feed them. So visually I could see that we needed to get a little bit more performance in our herd. I wasn't so much concerned about weaning weights or yearling weights, but we needed to get our cow size up, and we needed to be able to market a product that where we weren't getting dinged at the sale barn, because that was happening. Frame and weight, they were coming in lighter than we probably wanted, and they were a little bit shorter. And that's what kind of led me down the path of whether that be DNA testing and just having those conversations with people on, hey, I'm not looking to take a shortcut, because I know there are no shortcuts in ranching, but how can I expedite the process of genetic selection?
And we'll get into that in a second, but I think that what you're talking about here is the difference between maximizing and optimizing. And I think a lot of times what we seek to do, or what conventional agriculture has sought to do, is to maximize things. Well, you sure can. You can absolutely maximize things, but it's going to come at a cost of having to have outside fertility inputs, whatever that looks like. And so do you agree with that? Is that kind of the difference, that you're trying to optimize a cow for your operation that can survive in your environment and still perform at a acceptable level?
Yeah, a lot of, and I would say you're totally spot on. And I would say that because obviously every environment is different. You've had multiple people on the show who have talked about that. And I think people are so aware now of the benefits of epigenetics. And that's what I was looking to tap into. We live in eastern South Dakota. We're in a 30-inch rainfall environment, which sounds like plenty of rain, but also to our soil type, it's one of those things where 30 inches of rain doesn't necessarily get you any further than maybe 15 inches does somewhere else.
Yeah.
And we have a very, very washy grass system of tame cool season grasses, where they become very washy. Like for a great example last year is we had 5 more inches of annual precipitation than we normally do. And we definitely noticed a breed up in our 2 and 3 year olds. They had plenty of pasture. We were rotating them regularly, but once we ran those forage analysis tests, we saw that the grass was only 45 to 55% total digestible nutrients. And when you have a grass that's that low in total digestible nutrients, and you're trying to get a 2 and a 3 year old rebred that's also growing and still has a calf head side, that can be challenging. So what we're trying to do is find that cow that not only fits our environment, maximizes what she can do here without totally going overboard.
Let's take a quick break and hear a word from our sponsor today, the Soil Health Academy. We've been fortunate to feature some of the world's leading regenerative ag and adaptive grazing experts on our show, and many of those experts are farmer-rancher instructors for the nonprofit Soil Health Academy. This year, you'll have several opportunities to experience and profit from attending one of their remarkable on-farm schools and workshops. Whether you're interested in learning more about diversifying corn and bean rotations to increase profitability, merging multi-species and marketing, grazing on the high plains and in northern environments, regenerative farming and ranching, or enhancing profits and production in your beef or dairy operation, the Soil Health Academy has a school for you. One of the best investments you can make is in yourself, so visit www.soilhealthacademy.org to learn more and register. Financial assistance scholarships are available. So you've mentioned a couple of times seeing those fertile cows and the maternal cows and some of those things. Was in the beginning, and maybe even still today, was that simply reverse engineering? Like, okay, we're looking at the cows that got bred and they all kind of have these similar traits. They all kind of look this same way. Is that how it worked?
Yeah. So once we were, like you said, reverse engineering, whether it be there, because there are still some cows that when we turn the Cowherd over that are still here, which by my guess is impossible. I don't even know how it happens, just because they are larger framed. But then once we got our base down with the cows looked very similar, It's hard to tell a lot of them apart. And so when looking at that, my next question then became, okay, how can we really start to differentiate? I like what we have, but what is each individual animal telling me? Because these animals look the same, they perform similar, but how come this one falls out of the herd, but this one advances, year after year, despite being under the same breeding conditions, the same range conditions. And as you know, in eastern South Dakota, we don't have access to a lot of pasture. A lot of it's been broken up into farm ground. So what I'm trying to do is, how can I find that competitive advantage to not only run more cattle with better grazing, but also run more cattle who all have a nice uniform look, but trying to solve some of the problems along the way of whether it be fallout or simply raising a smaller calf, or, and I think that's where a lot of the data plays in as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And let's get into that. Let's talk about the DNA testing. You mentioned basically you're trying to balance, optimize performance. I guess Craig Guffey was your influence, so we'll say balance. You're trying to balance performance with also fertility. Are those kind of the two things that you're trying to keep in balance? Are they the kind of top of the list?
Yeah. So when you look at whether it be whatever DNA test you use, whether some are familiar with the Identity beef test from Neogen, which is the one that I use with Egg Boost, or Zoetis has one, the whole goal of that test is to see which traits are in balance and which are out of balance. So I know Mark Tagg from Egg Boost has been on the podcast before. He has the best describer of it. You don't want to be a 1 or you don't want to be a 10, but you want to be a 5 across the board and everything. Is that possible? No, because the scoring system is 1 to 10. It's not possible to be 5 and everything. But how are we trying to balance our most crucial traits? And, for example, one of the traits that I probably look for the most, especially say, let's talk about heifers. If I have all my yearling heifers, we retain them all. We DNA test them, and then we'll sort them based on, visual. I'll look at them visually, and then we'll look at the DNA results, and then we'll look at things like that. But the first thing I'm always looking for in a heifer, okay, what's her calving age direct? Is she going to calve easy, or is she going to be a hard calver where you're more likely to pull a calf? What's her birth weight? And then from some of those maternal traits, I then go on and look at, okay, what's her residual feed intake? Residual feed intake being, is she going to eat a lot of grass, or is she going to eat less grass and still gain weight? For example, we have some all-star heifers this year. So scale 1 to 10, I'll give you a quick rundown. The lower the residual feed intake, the better. So we have some that are a 2 on the 1 to 10 scale for residual feed intake, but their average daily gain is 5. So they're eating less than your normal animal, but then they're still gaining weight. At double the rate of, say, their competitor, who's maybe a 6 or a 7 on the residual feed intake, but still average daily gain of 5. So you're looking for those kind of things as well. And the other thing that, I don't get too caught up into a lot of it. We do have the beef business, but so there's the maternal, there's the performance, and then there's the carcass. So the things that we look on the carcass, it gives you a tenderness score. It gives you a marbling score, gives you a hot carcass weight score. Is this going to be a larger or smaller carcass? So yeah, we always start visually first, though. We never jump right to the DNA. I still want to visually appraise that animal, see what they look like phenotypically, because there are things that the DNA test obviously doesn't account for, which is, what do her feet look like? What is her mother, how is she structurally built? Does she have a good slope from hooks to pins, things like that.
Yeah, certainly. So have you guys been collecting your own DNA data as well, and sending that off and putting that into your database as well?
Yeah. So we started small, because I was skeptical at first, like most people are with DNA or EPDs, anything like that. So we started small. We bought some bulls, and we DNA tested them. Kind of gave us a baseline to know where our 5 bulls were at with, the cows we were going to cover and the heifers that year. And we thought, wow, this is really interesting, the data we got back. And then the next year, after that, we DNA tested all of our heifers, and then we were really able to put the sort on them that way, visually and with the data that we were receiving from AgBoost. And now we've gone as far as I'm pretty much testing every animal now. We've been doing it long enough with the direct market beef business. It's been really interesting to see, okay, which animals have the higher average daily gain, and we're using some of those for our direct market beef business so that they can finish sooner, especially being in a grass finished beef. They're finishing longer than a grain finished animal anyways. So how can we kind of circumvent that and get them to finish quicker on the forage resource that we have? The heifers one, I would say the data we use the most is definitely when we're on heifers. We didn't DNA test a lot of our cows when we started, simply for the fact that you kind of know what you have in your cows, and with the cost, when I first started to do it, I didn't want to go all the way into the deep end. So then we started with the heifers, and that's kind of been the thing now. And once you start with the heifers, that's data you have now forever.
Yeah, talk to me a little bit about how it influences your decision-making process in the, and some of the things that you're looking for. Is it the same as the list that you gave earlier? But yeah, talk to me about some of the ways that the genomic testing has influenced decision-making at your place.
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that it has done is, instead of, not that you're necessarily going into it blind, but say you have a pen of 50 heifers and they all look very similar, it's easy to say, well, they all look similar, so they should all be very similar. And what we found through genomic testing is sometimes yes, but sometimes no. And so the first thing we'll do is we'll breed all the heifers, and after breeding them all, then we'll take the DNA data and we'll say, okay, which ones were born in the first 21 days of the calving cycle. Okay, those are the ones that we want to keep. The second 45 days are the ones that we want to sell. Okay, and then you look at the ones in the first 21 days of the calving cycle. Okay, they pass the test phenotypically, then they get to move on to the next round. And then from there, then we'll really put the DNA data to the test. It's like, okay, if we only have this year though, so much room, if it's a drier year, or if we think, if we're already at capacity, then we'll look at, like I'd mentioned before, we'll look at Cavanese direct, Cavanese maternal, which is the genomic factor of what kind of Cavanese are they going to pass on to their offspring. And then from there, birth weight's always a good one to look at. Milk, similar to EPDs and the Angus Association. I think a lot more guys now are focused on less milking of a female, and we'll look at that. And obviously, as you know, all of this stuff, and Mark said it best, I can't remember if he said it in your episode or not, it's not 100%. It's not foolproof. They say they're right about 80% of the time. And that's something that we found to be pretty consistent, actually, now that we've been doing it long enough. And so we go back to there. Okay, you got your milk. And then I'll look, and then once I move on to maternal, then I'll look more, kind of at the, what do I call them? The performance. I'll see, okay, what's your residual feed intake, average daily gain, and things of that nature. And that's how the residual feed intake was a big one when we started keeping our own bulls, because we have about half bought in bulls and then half home raised bulls now. We've gotten to that point where we really wanted to put the DNA testing to, the money, it's money where, its mouth. How does that saying goes? You
Put our
really
money where
wanna,
our mouth is.
there you go. That's the one. We really wanted to put that, and we're like, we can do all this testing, but if you're that confident in it, why not try it with our own bulls? So we have probably 3 home raised bulls now that we'll use this year, and then the other 3 that are bought in. So, and what we've really focused on the bull side too, I don't want to leave the heifers behind, but I will say that the offspring of those heifers and those cows, we're looking at residual feed intake and average daily gain to add that boost of performance to not only our heifer crop, but our steer crop.
Yeah. And residual feed intake, average daily gain, kind of measures of efficiency, right?
Yes. So what you're looking for is, an animal may have, so back to your scoring scale of 1 to 10, as I had mentioned before, you have a lower residual feed intake with a higher average daily gain. That's going to be one of your most efficient animals. Even if it, though, does have a little bit higher feed intake, but the average daily gain is still a little bit higher, that's still, a 1-to-1 ratio. That's still very good according to all the tests that we've seen real world and what Egg Boost talks about. So that's been a big one for us, and I think a lot more people are starting to focus on that. You see that in the Angus community too, the ones who follow EPDs with the feed intake, and then the energy and things like that. I think those EPDs for the registered breeders are getting more and more play because people understand how important that is.
Certainly. So what percentage would you say, after we've got these girls were bred in the first 21 days, they were calves that were born in the first 21 days, are both of those things that you're using, or is it just the born in the first 21 days?
So we're only selecting from the ones that were calved or born in the first cycle.
Okay. So then, they pass that test. They're a replacement heifer who is bred, who was also herself born in the first 21 days. What percentage after that would you say are cut based on genomic testing results?
Yeah, I would say we still cut another 10 to 15%, simply based on if we see something. Here's a good real world example that bit me in the butt a couple years ago. We had some really nice heifers. Phenotypically, they look beautiful, and I thought, this is the DNA. This is what the DNA is saying, but I'm going to try and breed them anyways and keep them in the herd. Well, and this is why we started doing the additional 10 to 15% cut. We had that group of heifers, there was probably 12 to 15, if I remember correctly, that they had what's called a heifer pregnancy rate. That's also a genomic score. It's a predictor of fertility, and stayability is another one that goes hand in hand with that one. And it will, they kind of tie together of how easily will they get pregnant, and stayability tries to show that they'll stay in the herd for 5 years or longer. So we had these heifers that they had a heifer pregnancy rate of 1 and 2. It was out of a certain bull, all out of the same bull, because we genomically tested the bull after, because it was a bought-in bull. So we saw that the heifer pregnancy rate was low. Stayability was okay, 3 to 5, which is average, probably on that 1 to 10 scale. But the heifer pregnancy rate, which I would have been better off just cutting them early, because lo and behold, they didn't get pregnant. And it was a drier year, so they were challenged a little bit more. But any of the heifers, we went back and looked, and I talked with Mark Tagg about this, because I wanted to pick his brain. Like, I couldn't believe I was actually seeing the data and then seeing it real world, because it's just hard to buy into the numbers that much. And like I said, there's always that variability of error, but to see it real world was cool, because those 12 to 15 heifers had a heifer pregnancy rate, like I said, of 1 and 2. But then the ones that all got bred, even on the drier year, they were a heifer pregnancy rate and a stayability. I believe the lowest one was a 4, and all the rest were all the way up to 8.
Wow. Yeah, that's cool to see that work out that way. I mean, it's not cool necessarily for you, but it's cool to see that, we can have some confidence in these numbers. And if you're right 80% of the time with the cows you pick to sell or keep, I mean, that's going to be a huge help, right?
Oh, absolutely. And then the interesting thing, going back to what you said, was not cool, but we turned it into a cool moment, as for someone else that maybe doesn't care about that. We were able to sell them as rebreeds, as falls, and we gave them a few more chances. They didn't fit our operation, but they were able to fit still with the confines of making money on our operation.
Well, and some people have raised questions about that in the past, about rebreeds and selling rebreeds. And, I know people who are doing it at scale. I think, at least we're going again way back 7 years ago, the Padlock Ranch was doing that, selling all their rebreeds, heifers that didn't catch the first round, selling them as fall calvers, and they've got repeat customers, people that buy them year after year because they work in their environment in a fall calving regime of management. It's something different about where they're headed and being fall calvers they work. there, but they don't work for the Padlock Ranch as spring calving cows. And do we know why? Probably not.
We probably don't know why, but the thing that I've found on some of the rebreeds that we've sold over the years, and we've had some of the same people, kind of like Padlock, come back and say, hey, if you have any more of those fall calves, or if you have any more late breds in the, July or whatever that is, because we do leave the bull in, but we only keep the first 2 cycles. Those, much like Wineglass Ranch does, they'll sell those laters. And we've had a lot of people who have had good luck with them simply for the fact that they probably feed a lot better than I do. I'm not underfeeding by any means, but a lot of people in eastern South Dakota, have access to very good feed, whether that be alfalfa, baleage, things that are much more high energy, where most of our heifer development and our cow development looks very similar in the sense of grazing as long as we can, utilizing crop residue. Then in the dormant season, once we're out of stockpiled grass and crop residue, we're doing it at just grass hay with protein supplement. The last few years, we've used soy hull pellets, which they almost have zero starch in them. I think they're 1.64% starch, so it fits into wanting us to keep the rumen in a fibrous state and keep developing that forage base for our cows and then in our heifers and et cetera.
Yeah, no, I think that's very true. You're not substitution feeding, you're supplement feeding. And so that becomes you got to work, girls. There's food out there for you. You're going to have to go get it. I'll bring you something to help, but I'm not going to give you everything you need to eat. Whereas if your cows are eating out of a TMR every day, then they will probably perform better than they would at your place, or be able to breed up easier than they would at your place. Is that kind of what I'm hearing you say?
Yeah, and I don't even remember who told me this. It was an older vet. Either said you're breeding for fertility or you're feeding for fertility.
Yeah.
And I've heard that multiple times, but it rings so true. And that's, again, what we've seen with I think the DNA is a good marker of natural fertility, and exposing the animals that probably have more built-in fertility from a breeding standpoint rather than a fed-in one, because you can pretty much get anything bred if you feed it good enough.
Yep. Yeah. Oh yeah, 100%. That's the whole ranching for profit deal is you go to the workshop and they talk to you and they say, well, what percentage of the cows that got bred would have gotten bred if you didn't do anything? And then let's find how low we can go and still get an acceptable percentage of the cows bred, and then figure out how to market the ones that don't get bred, and keep on. And that's kind of basically what you're saying. This whole journey has been essentially is doing that as well, right?
Yeah, and that was the whole thing with starting when flipping over the Cowherd. It was, okay, we need to find our base, but we need to still be profitable. And with my analytics background and my numbers background, I'm very much in tune with whether that be Microsoft Excel or however you manage your ranch program. That's how I've always seen it, because I have 4 kids myself. I want them to be involved someday. And my dad and my grandfather have done an incredible job of not only acquiring and paying off the land. And I don't want to be the one that loses it. So, to run cows, I don't want to run them just to run them, which a lot of people do, whether that be in eastern South Dakota or wherever, just because they have the pasture. But I want them to actually be a profitable enterprise. And 9 years ago, cow calf arguably was not the most enriching enterprise to be in that time. But if we were going to start over, we had to do it with in the mindset of making it sustainable and a continuing thing where we want it to keep getting better and better year after year. I think it's so easy for cow herds to become stagnant because of breeding practices or just mismanagement, and that's not something I wanted, because I saw a lot of that growing up. My dad he's a very good row crop farmer. My grandpa was a good row crop farmer. Row cropping is what we knew, so I wanted to turn the cattle to be equally as a good a business as our row cropping business. And I just have never had a love for row cropping. It's always been on the livestock side of it. So I figured, well, if we're going to have the business, let's make it the best business that it can be.
Well, in Brookings, it's either corn, soybeans, Florida, or corn, soybeans, cows. I mean, and if you've been to Florida once and you've fought through that traffic, and yeah, you don't need to do that again. So why not do cows?
Yeah, exactly. And the return on the cows is much better than Florida.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you can get vitamin D. You can still get
Right.
vitamin D outside in
20
Brookings
below.
sometimes. Yeah,
Yeah.
just not very long, but
Right.
So, anyways, how talk to me about how this strategy has enabled you to make changes more quickly, to really speed up that process. One of the things that we deal with especially in the genetics realm, is that gestational lag of, well, is this going to work? Is this bull actually going to help move us forward in this regard?
Yeah. The DNA testing, the thing that I saw first, and that pertains to your question, was speeding up progress and improving selection. If I can speed up progress and improve my selection criteria, that not only leads way to a better predictor of performance early on in their life. So I'm not waiting around with that. It's not like sheep where I'm not a sheep man, but I know they can get multiple lamb crops a year, where that's not the case with a cow. 9 months inevitably seems like a long time sometimes when you're really trying to make progress. So, and that's kind of why I went to Craig, and I'm like, Craig, this is Craig Guffey, as we had mentioned earlier. Why, or how can I add what your list was? I gave him a list of things I wanted to add and I wanted to improve on. And it's like, how do I know how to do that? And he just gave me some basic guidelines, got me set up, on the Ag Boost factor. But, it's essentially cutting years off trial and error, because before we were using Ag Boost as our platform, you would go to Ricky Highland, for example. I bought multiple bulls from him. You buy a bull from him, you wait for that calf crop, then you wait for them to, then you wait for them to get their daughters into production, and then you see what their daughters, by the time you actually figure out what you have in the calf, that bull's probably long gone by that time. And that's what I wanted to speed up, because being in my late 30s, I'm not old by any means, but if I want to have something that's viable and economical that I can pass on to my family, 20 to 30 years from now, I better get going. I started in my early 30s. We didn't start, Ag Boost until it was a couple of years after the total rebuild of the Cowherd. So that was my biggest thing. It's like speeding up progress and improving selection. That was probably my career criteria. I didn't know what I was going to get. I didn't know if it was going to work. I didn't know if I believed, because I didn't believe in EPDs, so I didn't know if I believe in DNA or not. But I will say the one thing about DNA is the DNA data never changes. You get what you get. Unlike EPDs, where it's always a sliding scale of the latest and the greatest.
Yeah, for sure. They keep on shifting what's normative as cows
target
get bigger. Yep, as cows get bigger and all these other metrics change, that thing, the grade, just keeps on shifting upwards, not in terms of value generated necessarily, I don't think, but in terms of pounds weaned, and those things. And
yes,
we know the kind of results of that in a lot of ways. So I think before we wrap up here, let's talk a little bit about the home raised bulls and kind of how that's going and what have been some of the keys there.
Yeah, the home raised bull was something we started 2 years ago. We didn't do it right away because we obviously, like I had mentioned, we wanted to see what we had in the product, and the DNA testing and the genomic work in itself. And the last breeding season, and then so 2023 and then 2024. Now in 2025, we will be we'll be getting a majority of our calf crops from our home raised bulls. We're putting them now in situations where they're going to sire a majority of our calves. And the thing that we've seen Oh, even my vet made a comment this past summer. It was in early July, hot, and we were getting the bulls tested before we turned them out on the 26th of July. And he made a really cool comment. All the home raised bulls had better semen scores than our bought in ones. That doesn't mean the bought in bulls had bad semen scores or they didn't pass, because they did well. But we had a couple of home raised bulls solely based off, our selection criteria that I had talked about earlier, that he would have called, if I had to give them a grade, it would be an A to an A plus. So that's been cool to see. The fertility side of it has really helped. We had on another thing on the bull side, we had one of our, because with the DNA test, you also get a parentage test. So we turned out last year on our heifers, we turned out two yearling bulls of our own, right? And then one bought in one. And the home raised bulls outperformed the bought in one. I think it was almost double. So yeah, it's been really cool to see. And I think that maybe has equal parts to do with DNA selection and the selection criteria, but I also think it goes back to epigenetic environment selection, finding animals that are, accustomed to your place. I mean, if you ever listen to John Maddox talk about their bull selection, it's the same thing, and that was another reason, in addition to the bulls, we quit buying in outside females as well, is because we just found that the heifers that we raised under our own selection criteria, and now that the bulls we're raising are actually a better product. That doesn't mean they would probably be a better product for everybody, but in our scenario, it's working a lot better. And we're in our calving window, since we started using home raised bulls, probably improved 8 to 10% as well.
Wow.
The number of breds in the first 45 days versus, because like I said, we leave the bulls in for 60, but only keep the first 2 cycles. And now we're at about 90% of calves being born in the first 30 days.
Wow. Yeah, that's very cool. Okay, so I want to run an illustration past you. So would you say that when you're looking at a genomic test, you've got what you have in your herd represents, in a Velcro relationship, represents the hooks, and what you're trying to buy represents the loops, and you're trying to find animals that will mesh well with what you already have? Is that kind of a helpful way to think about it?
Yeah, and that's probably the perfect way to think about it. And I'll give you an example of, so say we do, because we have from time to time bought in a group of yearling heifers, not bred or anything like that, but then we'll go to those buyers that we know have what we like and that we know about their program, but then we'll buy all those heifers and then we'll DNA test them ourselves once we get them, and then we'll kind of that integrate them into our system that way. So before they get anything else, before they get put with the bull or anything like that, we'll just DNA test them, because like I said, we have that direct market beef business. We'll take the ones that we want to integrate into our herd. Like, yeah, we think this one would be good, but let's know for a fact, because then she can go to the beef sector. This other one can go into our breeding herd. And that seemingly has been best. We've done it the other way too, where we bred them and then did the DNA testing, but kind of like that example I gave you before, we've seen more fallout that way. So yeah, trying to integrate the right animals is still very possible, but before you put any bull with them or do any other leg work, we do a lot of the genomic work first.
Yeah. Has this process made your direct market beef business better?
I would say 100%, only from the standpoint of, when we first started the direct market beef business on the grass finished beef, in the summertime and during the growing season, they're grazing. They do get a zero starch supplement or a low starch supplement in the dormant season when we're feeding them alfalfa, orchard grass, hay is their base diet. And what we found is it's cut way back on the finishing time. So when we first started, a lot of our animals were being finished in 30 to 34 months, I would say. And now we've been able to cut that back to 24 to 26 months. And we've seen that solely because a lot of the animals we were using early on that we were DNA testing, the bulls that they were out of they were nice, moderate frame looking cattle, but their average daily gain was down in the twos, and their carcass weights were down in the twos and threes. So they were I hate using the word performance because performance has such a bad stigma attached to it, but you still do need performance. Even in the moderate cattle realm, you still need performance or you'll see a lot of fallout. So by selecting those cattle that have higher average daily gain, moderate moderate residual feed intake, and then a little bit, 4 to a 6 on the hanging or the hot carcass weight, it's cut back dramatically on our finishing time. And I have some great compliments from our butcher because sometimes grass-fed beef doesn't always get the best, raving reviews as far as fat cover and things like that. And I have some great testimony from our butcher that we use and a lot of cool pictures of, wow, these cattle can flesh up on forage only, and they have the fat cover to match grain finished animal, etc.
Mm-hmm. Wow, very cool. Last question. Would you just give some advice, talk about some lessons learned, some resources that you would recommend if somebody wants to go down this road? Where would you send them?
Yeah, if you're interested in, learning more about genomic testing, as I was when, whether you're in the middle of a cowherd rebuild or you're just getting started, the best way to do it is talk to someone who's doing it. I had zero idea about the concept and I didn't know anything, more than my neighbor did or whatever. So I just reached out to guys and I said, okay, what is this all about? How is this working for you? Some of the best names I can give you right now are Craig Guffey, as we mentioned. He has one of the larger probably portfolios on genomically tested cattle. Jorgensen Land and Cattle in South Dakota is an extensive user. They kind of have their own genomic profile that they've developed. Mark Tag at Ag Boost, and you don't even have to use Ag Boost per se, but they have a great system that allows you to visually see all of that. So start with those guys, get your information down, and I always caution people, start small. The genomic testing itself for a full panel displayed on Ag Boost system is about $50. So $50 may seem like a lot to a lot of people, and it may be. So start small, start with your bulls and then say, oh, I kind of like what this is showing me. Okay. And then like I did, go to your heifers, do your heifer crop, or say only the ones that were born in the first 21 days if you have a selection criteria, and try it. I think the $50 test in itself, which seemed like a lot to me in the beginning, showed me that for that $50, it allows me to make a marketing decision on that animal earlier rather than later. Instead of feeding that animal for 2 years or 18 months or whatever, I can make a decision on her when she's weaned.
Yeah, that's good. I lied. It wasn't my last question. Do you think that this tool has sped up? I know the answer to this question, but I'd like to hear your perspective on it. This tool has sped up your ability to make changes in your herd rather than just say, hey, we're going to breed our heifers every year. We're going to breed them for 21 days. Are you in a better place now in the same amount of time than you would have been if you just would have bred every heifer for 21 days and let the chips fall where they may?
Yes, and you're right. You did know the answer to that question, but I think it's more complex than that. The complexity of the question becomes, it's comes down to management or what resources do you have. When you have fewer resources as far as limited land base, or you only have so many heifers you can keep every year, that's where I would say it made the selection process and the improvement that much faster. Because when you have a group of cows that all look the same, they perform similar, and you always know which ones raise a little bit bigger calf or whatever, but what's under the hood of that animal, that's the stuff that really interests me. And like you said, even if you're only right 80% of the time, that's still a high percentage of data that you can use to make a selection moving forward. And I would even encourage guys who maybe like Craig, for example, he has a very large herd, but he still uses it in the same ways I'm using it, but he still he's still moving the needle forward even after continuously being in the ranching business for 30 plus years. I think the thing we need to all understand is that nobody's perfect in their selection criteria. Nobody has all the answers. And what tools can we use in our toolbox per se that can help us not only become more profitable, but have a better product at the end of the day? And I think coming down to having a better product is, who doesn't want better cows? Who doesn't want a tighter breeding window? And who doesn't want cattle that calve easier? I mean, think about that. Calving ease always gets a bad rap because calving ease typically in the olden days was equated to smaller calves and things like that. And that's not something we've seen, because even with the calving ease direct and the calving ease maternal, cows that calve easy, we still have, by selecting the ones with a proper growth rate, we still have very acceptable calves that sell very well, at the auction. And in the real world test of it, we bought a bull from a gentleman in Montana, ended up being a very good bull for our operation, really, really moved the needle. And what we saw on paper, or on whether it be EPD, we looked at the EPD first because we hadn't DNA tested him yet. Then we got him to our place and DNA tested him. And then we seen the calf crop. He sired probably over 60 calves in a 2-year window that we ended up keeping. And his calving ease direct was a 7, which Egg Boost and Identity Beef will say that's like a no touch. You won't have to touch a calf. And out of those 60 some that we had out of that particular bull, we had to only touch one heifer, and that's because it was born backwards. So I think when the proof is in seeing the visual with the real world data, and that's why it has made it easier, and it's made us buy into it even more, is because of the real world. Because that's what everybody wants, is the real world results. Everybody can sell a pipe dream, but unless it's actually doing something and pulling that lever and moving the needle forward for you, nobody's going to jump on board.
Yeah, absolutely. Tyson, very good stuff today. Thanks for your time.
Appreciate you having me.
Very good stuff there with Tyson. Really appreciate him sharing that experience. And I think that the value of this conversation is really that we are seeing a cattleman's perspective on genomic testing, that this isn't something for the packer or for the industry's goals. This is a cattleman, somebody who loves maternal genetics, somebody who loves Bonsma and all of these thinkers about good genetics, Larry Lenhart and all these guys that we've talked about many times on the podcast. And he's still using genomic testing for that, to accomplish that and have a herd that performs. And so I really, really appreciate that. Coming up next on the Working Cows podcast, we'll be talking to Kent Solberg and Jeremy Sweeten about improving the wildlife habitat on your farm and ranch and ways to capitalize on that. One of the many ancillary benefits of regenerative agriculture is that you will improve wildlife habitat and you will attract more wildlife. How do you benefit from that? How do you capitalize on that? We're going to talk to Jeremy and Kent about just that coming up next on the Working Cows podcast. We'll see you then.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.